Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
Ready?
Yep. Let's go. Let's laugh. We are imperfect after all.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to the Imperfect Us podcast.
I'm Leanne Camilleri.
And I'm Lisa Downs. As hosts of the Imperfect Us podcast, we share relatable stories that celebrate we are all perfectly imperfect humans leading perfectly imperfect lives. We discover practical and evidence-based strategies that draw on the science of well-being and positive psychology that help us to uncover the barriers that might hold us back from being our authentic selves and turn them into opportunities so that we can show up more consistently, doing what we really aspire to do and who we want to be.
We acknowledge the Wadawurrung and the Kaurna people as traditional custodians of the beautiful lands on which this podcast is being recorded. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to other First Nations people who are here with us today. So, let's get started. Hey there, before we start today's episode, we want to let you know that part of this conversation refers to suicide, which we know can be distressing. So we ask you to please take care of yourself. If you need any resources or support, please go to beyondblue.org, or for 24-hour free counselling in Australia, call Lifeline on 131114.
It is such a pleasure to introduce our next guest and my friend Mariane Power. Mariane is a sneaker-wearing, spirit-dancing clinical psychologist, speaker, workshop facilitator and an executive coach and entrepreneur with an obsession in all things related to meaningful living, human potential and neurodiversity. Mariane is a co-founder of the Posify Group with her sister and partner in possibility, Jenna McConnelly. And Mariane recently created Messy Magic, which is an online program helping ADHD women radically accepting their brains and learning the skills that can help them to navigate their challenges and maximise their strengths. Marianne's top strength is a zest and a love of learning, reflected in her academic pathway, where she boasts a Bachelor of Performance, a graduate diploma in counselling and psychotherapy, and more recently a Master's in Clinical Psychology. Well, let's dive on in. Hello, my friend Mariane. It is so exciting to have you as our guest today. And thank you so much for joining us.
I'm very excited to be here. Firstly, because I get to see your smiling face over Zoom, but it feels like a long-awaited conversation. I'm the biggest fan of your podcast.
Oh, well, we're really, really excited to have you on here. So thank you so much. Hey, we would really love to hear about what led you to do the work that you're doing. Are you able to just give us a little bit of an insight as to where that started perhaps, or what inspired you to do the work you're doing?
Ooh, yeah, I struggle with this question. I'm going to be honest. I came across the term multi-hyphenate recently, which has helped, because a lot of the times when I find myself introducing the work that I do or who I am and how I show up in the world, I wear a lot of hats, both personally and professionally. So I guess I could probably pull it all together with my own purpose, which is quite a deep one, and it's to alleviate human suffering. And when I say that, I mean unnecessary human suffering, because I think there's a lot of suffering that is important and necessary and comes that we need to move through it. But there's a lot of unnecessary human suffering. And so that's really my deep purpose. And from that, to help people then connect to their own purpose and develop their potential so they can create impact. So I guess that connects everything together. And how I came about that purpose was really through my own wayfinding journey of personal and professional bumps along the way, all the imperfect mess that happens with life, and some of the magic as well. But I could probably trace it back right to being a kid. And I was one of those, teachers might say annoying, depending on what kind of teachers you're referring to, but annoying kids who would just ask why, like nothing was simple. I just always wanted to understand what we were learning and why we were learning it, and particularly when it came into those big existential questions of why are we here, what's all this about. So from a really young age, I was very curious about humans and what it is that we're here for and how we all get along and what that's about. And I took a lot of values as well. I guess my parents have been an incredible influence in my life and my sister's life. Growing up, a sense of service was really instilled in us, and compassion. Mum and Dad were always reinforcing, think about the other person's side of the picture. How can you show up and share what you have in a way that's generative and kind? So, we were really lucky growing up to have our parents influence the way that we saw the world, and they gave us a lot of opportunities to try everything. And I mean, like, when I say everything, I don't think that there's a sport that I haven't tried. I failed at lots of them. I think I played in the end 8 different musical instruments growing up through high school, debating, looking back on it. And we'll touch on this later in the conversation, I know, but I was diagnosed quite late with ADHD. And looking back on it, I was very fortunate that my parents really catered for the hyperactive part of my profile. So yeah, I was just a curious kid. I unfortunately experienced a traumatic event at 19, which I don't tend to go into details because I don't think it's the details that are important. But what is significant is that at a time in the world and in history where, I mean, this was, just after 2000. So to give context, Beyond Blue had only just been born. This is a time in a world where probably the information that we have about mental health and mental ill health and clinical complications wasn't really all that well distributed. So there were definitely psychologists and treating health professionals and people doing really good work and research in the mental health space, but we didn't have positive education. We didn't have all of that information distributed to, general health practitioners like GPs. So I found myself in a situation where I had a cluster of symptoms that I didn't really know what to do with. And it wasn't until I came across a really good friend who supported me and said, I think this has been going on for long enough. I was getting a lot of flashbacks. I was struggling in my day-to-day living, having a really hard time. And so I found myself in a therapy room and fell in love with the process of therapy, because being a curious person, it wasn't just about getting treatment. And for those listening, I'm using those little air quotes. It was all about the process. And it was like, wow, how can I as a person learn these skills and apply this thinking and have not just then an experience of healing and all of those clinical symptoms going away, but then growth. So that was fascinating to me. In parallel, I came out of school and went straight into acting school. So I was really lucky. I did super duper duper well in my HSC, but didn't open my marks because I'd already been accepted into acting school. And that was what I wanted to do and be. I was lucky that I got to have a stab at that. And so acting then moved me into work in producing and presenting and voiceover work, and all the time just really fascinated about the stage. And looking back on that, I think the stage gave me a really lovely way to try and understand the world through the lens of characters and through the lens of other people's experiences and stories. So really that fascination with human behavior, I think, has probably always been there. Yeah, it's funny because you get to, I mean, I'm 41 now, and sort of look back and join the dots. And we talk to the kids about how, careers aren't linear anymore, but I've never had that experience of my career being linear. So it's funny, I'm sort of, I guess, a bit of a walking, talking example of, I think, where this next generation is probably headed. But yeah, probably to sum up and try and join all the dots together for you. So I was acting, producing, had this experience of myself in personal life. And then we had our oldest quite young. So I was 22 and I fell pregnant with her, and I was producing and doing all that jazz and finding that really tough with motherhood, just because, acting world and the theatre and all of that jazz, late nights, it's unpredictable. You're often away for work as well. And a colleague of mine, a fellow actress, Lara Cox, actually was studying psychotherapy and counselling at the time. And she and I caught up after we'd filmed a movie together. And she said, I'm doing this thing and I think you'd really love it. Why don't you come check it out? And so I got introduced to the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And then that was kind of it. I was hooked and obsessed. I got to the end of my grad dip in group. We did group psychotherapy, family dynamics work. And got to the end of that, I was a bit frustrated because I couldn't work with the people I wanted to work with because there was no rebate through Medicare. So that threw me then I threw myself into psychology and then clinical psychology. So all of these years later, it's kind of culminated. I was really lucky to have some pretty disruptive supervisors through my honours project and then my master's, who, though I studied clinical psychology and went through honours in kind of that medicalised space, I positioned a lot of positive psychology interest points. So my thesis and my research was always around that idea of purpose being the intersection between clinical suffering and then also into growth and flourishing. So I was very fortunate in that way. It's meant that I've been able to have a really rich and rewarding career as a clinical psychologist, being my official title, but across into executive coaching work and performance coaching work and writing programs that really lean in on the whole spectrum of human health and behavior. So yeah, I'm very fortunate in that way.
That's just such a diverse background that you have, such an interesting story.
Thanks. Even when I hear myself, I'm like, oh, it's funny when you look back on your own bits and bobs and ins and outs, isn't it? And trying to join the dots, and some of them don't join, some of them do join, but that's all about the meaning making that we do, which is so beautiful as humans.
The journey that gets you from one point to another is always, really interesting. And at the core, we've heard already that meaning and purpose has been there for you. And when we have that inner compass, that thing that drives us to do the things that we do, it's powerful.
Yeah, it served me pretty well, I must admit.
Yeah. And it's funny when you were sharing your whole story, Maz, I'm sorry, Leanne, I probably didn't say, so Mariane is also called Maz by lots of her friends and things. So if I say Maz for short, now you can understand why. But
Hey.
the story with your family and how you were raised, and I think in some respects, I think that's why I've gravitated towards you, because my life was also very similar to yours, and the parenting and so forth moving forward and the opportunities. And I always ended up moving towards, not the sad part of things or the I have to fix it stuff. It was much more about the growth. So that's why I think I've always been inspired by the things that you do.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. That's really kind. And likewise, I just love the creative burstness that happens when you and I jump on our chats or our little DMs and Instagram. And have you seen this? And have you seen that? And it's always that moving towards
Maybe
potential.
I'm one of those hyperphenate. Maybe
I think so. Multi-hyphenate. Well, and I also think that education attracts that, right? Like if you're a teacher at heart and I think if I had to probably choose a what do we call it? Industry to align myself, it probably would be education, because it's all about taking what we're finding and then sharing that. And if you're an educator at heart, then you tend up looking for pieces of information and sharing in a really generous way. Learning. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Jumping into curiosity all the time. Yeah.
Mariane, you recently created Messy Magic to support ADHD women and help them to understand and radically accept their brains and learn skills that help them to navigate their challenges and maximise their strengths. Can you share some of the insights to this program and the impact that it's having on the people that you're working with?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Again, it's funny, isn't it? They say with teaching, you always end up teaching the thing you need to learn yourself. So Messy Magic was really born out of, I found myself, well, to give context, I should probably share as well. It's maybe helpful to share that the two children, so I mentioned my oldest is now 17 and my youngest 14. So they are both twice exceptional kids. So a twice exceptional is a particular neurodivergent profile that's both gifted and has neurodevelopmental, we like to say differences, but I guess people might say use the term disabilities or disorders. So both my kiddos are ADHD and autistic as well as gifted. And so raising them has been really interesting. I mean, raising kids anyway is really interesting. But there's, in Australia at least, there's no formal identification process for twice exceptionals and no way of really supporting them in the education system. So as a mom, and particularly, moving through COVID, it's been a journey for both myself and my husband of needing to take a deep dive. I'm very lucky, obviously, I've got my psychology background, doing a deep dive into neurodivergence and ADHD and autism and giftedness and how do we support these kids. And in doing so this is back COVID days, 2021, I was really fortunate to be working with another fellow neurodivergent founder, Anna, who's the founder of Bambuda. And she managed to point out to me a little bit of a pattern of sprinting quite hard with our workflow and then almost burning out and needing to just disappear and retreat for a week. And she pointed this out to me, and through the lens of said, hey, Maz, have you ever considered that maybe you could also be ADHD? And I was like, yeah, no. I'm a psychologist. How could I have missed this? No ways. I don't identify. ADHD was always that. I've got my daughter was actually diagnosed quite late. My son was identified quite early, although we didn't move into treatment until later. But that bouncing kid that bounced off the walls. I started doing some reading and was like, oh yeah, right, okay, now I can see. And in my reading, I realized that a lot of the women that I'd been working with who had collected all of these other labels, so some of them along the way had collected borderline personality disorder, although that didn't really seem to fit when we worked together. They collected bipolar, they collected anxiety, depression, seasonal affective disorder, all of these labels over their lifetimes. Many of them also had traumatic events and experiences. And they were all starting to have this similar exploration and coming into sessions with me, some in the coaching work that I did and some in the more clinical work, and sharing that they got an ADHD diagnosis. What is going on? So being in the founder space as well, because I had or do have a company at the time, the Posify Group. And so we were doing a lot of, collective entrepreneurial work. Similarly, a lot of female founders were starting to self-identify or if not get their formal diagnosis. So we got together a little bit of a working group, take a really long story and try and get to the point, Maz. We do this as ADHDers too. We got together a bit of a working group and said, all right, so we're all women. We've all had this late diagnosis of ADHD. 1, how did we miss this? 2, has it got in the way for us? And 3, how has it helped us? And in doing so with this working group, I then put together a bit of a pilot program and ran it by the ladies and said, what would you like to see? What's already in the literature? What's missing? And the points that came out and that I'd observed through my own personal journey of getting my diagnosis and then looking into how I wanted to support myself moving forward for growth purposes was that there's not a lot of talk about our strengths. So there's a lot of recognition around growing recognition. I shouldn't say a lot, growing recognition of how ADHD shows up as being dysfunctional for women. And that's really important because I don't want to take away from the suffering and the distress. But there's not a lot of growth work there, and there's not a lot of using what we know works really well from positive psychology, even now into the clinical space, to help people acknowledge what some of their differences might be, but then actually leverage their strengths to be able to do well and to do better. And so the consequence of that is that we've got a whole generation of women who have spent a lot of their years masking and camouflaging. And actually, I'll send you a link to a paper. It's a research study by Marissa Milet. She's looked into social camouflaging in the ADHD population, and particularly with women, and how that's then contributed to unnecessary mental health distress as well for this population. It's a really interesting paper because we know a lot about masking, camouflaging in autism, but it hasn't actually, until this research, been captured in ADHD. So through the pilot, I was really excited to see that some of the helpful, so we took this working group and then I reestablished it as a, kind of like a semi-clinical pilot, invited people in and did a small, study of what was working well. Psychoeducation was a main, benefit. So a lot of the women reported that even just understanding what was actually happening in their brains, understanding the biological markers and the genetic influence, for some of the women, why the dysfunctional aspects of ADHD didn't show up until later in life. So interestingly, we know from the genetic research that there are both stable and dynamic genetic contributing parts to ADHD and how it articulates. So for many of us, even though that there were indicators in childhood, that's really important from a diagnostic perspective, they weren't problematic necessarily until the stress compounded later in life. And so it's often for girls and women, once they leave school and they have families, once they hit the hormones of pregnancy, there's some of those environmental factors that can set off the dynamic genetic contributors that then make ADHD really difficult to manage. So it's a psychoeducation. It was that common coming together with community and going, oh, you have this experience too. I thought it was just me. So the community and connection has been, probably one of the most powerful benefits of the program. And we do a lot of work around the inner critic and how it shows up for us specifically as ADHD women. Many of us describe this common experience of feeling like we're always too much and at the same time not enough. So there's a constant wrestling of I have an imagining of this huge potential that I might be working towards, and yet not quite a clear path of what that's going to look like. And sometimes an unraveling and having to overcompensate for some of my failings and forgettings because of my differences in the way I show up. So it's been a beautiful program. We're now in the 4th season, not including the pilot, and have had close to 50 women come through. So it's been a slow one because of my personal life, wanting it to be a little bit slow, but I'm really excited to be heading into the next season with it, where we'll have both the group participatory option and also a standalone program. And particularly because I think that psychoeducation is just so important for women to be able to get information that's really useful for them and for their families as well.
Leanne and I were actually talking about, just before you jumped on, about that word disability with ADHD or any neurodiversity. We were talking about the shift in language. We just need to change it so rapidly. And just that fact that it's difference as opposed to my disability, but my difference is that more positive lens on it's not a big problem and I don't have to fix that. There is just a difference there, but I can be aware of that, and then using self-compassion to help you explore that a bit further. I think that's just grabbed me straight away, that we need to, in schools in particular, we talk about children that have got neurodiversity as being problems. But they're not problems. They actually have the most amazing gifts, but we need to see through that and change the language that is used, I think, in schools.
Yeah, I think starting young makes such a big difference. I'll put a little bit of a caveat on that, though, both through my personal experience and also in speaking to the women that I've worked with and families in general, is that I think rather than shifting away from the disability language, it's really important to recognize that the disability sector serves us very well as well. And it helps us to acknowledge the very real suffering that does occur. So we know within the neurodivergent population, so when I'm saying neurodivergence, I'm talking about autism, OCD, for example, ADHD, Tourette's. I mean, there's a bunch, but 20% of the population is estimated to be what we consider neurodivergent. So the reality is that when you're a neurodivergent person living in a world that's built for neurotypicals, that's inhabited by 80% of neurotypicals, if that's how we're understanding it, it can be really tough. And we know from the statistics there are higher rates of comorbidities and mental illness. There are more obstacles in accessing education and into employment, difficulties there, exposure to trauma. I mean, the list goes on. And so I don't think that removing the language of disability is necessarily helpful, but I'd like to see it be additive. And that in the same way that for mental health, we now know that it's on a continuum and or, a whole sphere, if you like, of that we're fluid as humans, that we have seasons of not doing well and where we might dip into mental illness, and then we might move towards human flourishing, and then we might come back somewhere in between. There's been such a lot of beautiful work in that space. I'd like to see the language being additive in that, yes, there are seasons of disability, if you like, and or clinical implications, and then we just work and operate differently. And so how can we help our young people in particular, because I think it does start with youth, learn about their differences and how their brain uniquely works, and how they can then self-advocate and help communicate to other people who might not understand and not have that shared lived experience. It's always with any minority group, I guess, and there's different levels of minority. I also want to acknowledge that, and different levels of privilege. But with any minority group, unfortunately, it ends up being that it is the responsibility of the people within that minority group to educate others. But that's also a gift, right? Like, how would it be if a neurotypical person tried to educate me on my ADHD? I'd be like, well, hang on, and that's not what it's like for me. So I'd like to see us all move towards, in terms of that conversation around diversity and inclusion, move towards a place where we're more skilled in being curious about one another, and where we can hold space for non-judgment and for just understanding what works well, and what gets in the way, so that we can just help each other move towards being our best. I mean, it sounds very simple, doesn't it, when you put it that way?
It does sound very simple, but I think that's the reality. There's so many complexities that play in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think empowering people to understand that they have got those different lenses to look through their experience is really important. I know in education, a lot of my clients will lean in on advocacy with disability and disability rights. But then again, Lisa, as you were saying, understanding that we're all built differently and we've all got unique strengths, so important.
Yeah.
When I first went into psychology, I was very frustrated that CBT was the predominant way of treating people. And I was determined to bring some credits to the art therapy, music therapy, the drama therapy. And of course, that's all there now. I'm not sure if your listeners are aware of trauma-informed practices, but how very important that is right now, right, in our schools. A lot of the work that I'm now doing in the education space is around trauma-informed practice. And not just for the kiddos who have had direct exposure to trauma, but I think keeping in mind that this entire generation has just moved through a season of we don't really know what yet, but it's a lot. And I think what's really interesting is that what works well from a trauma-informed lens for our kids who have been through difficult situations also works really well in neurodivergent population. So Stephen Porges's work I draw on all the time, and helping people to connect first and foremost into their into their body and into their nervous systems. So I love that he repositions and says, well, instead of this behavior being bad or naughty, what if we looked at it as actually, this is a kid who's got a really sensitive nervous system, or this is an adult who operates in the world from senses first. And in an extraordinary fashion. I mean, I haven't yet met a neurodivergent person or a person who's experienced trauma who hasn't got these incredible, and I don't like to say superpowers because I know there's all this toxic positivity language going on right now, but they're superpowers, in the sense that not everybody shares them. They can connect in with higher levels of intuition, often can understand what's going on in the world around them before others pick up on some of those more subtle cues. But that's a really highly sensitive system that needs to be spoken to first and foremost. I don't mean directly with your verbal communication, but that needs to be honored and recognized. But there's cycles of shame that happen when you're operating from a system that is driven a lot by that fight or flight and that doesn't yet have skills to understand how to self-regulate or resources. That's something that I'm really driven to help alleviate.
And, we as the carers at school need to be able to let them run through their stress cycle and help them move through and try and eliminate some of those tricky parts that is going to actually be a trigger, trying to minimise those. But you don't know what they are unless you start working with them or ask questions. And, who better to know? It's their parents and the children themselves.
That's like curiosity again.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I love that senses first perspective. That makes so much sense. How would that language help others? Because when you think about that experience, maybe that provides some language for them to provide to others to this is how I show up. How powerful is that?
Yeah. And that's, that's a self-education piece in its own right. I mean, even just watching my own kids and their journeys through understanding their own sensory profiles, and it's still emerging. And it will, because our environment changes and we have different stresses come in. But I think to somebody who's trying to help a little one, just to consider, what is going around in their environment. So in psychology, we talk about like doing a functional behavior analysis. And I know that's kind of come across into education as well, particularly schools who are taking that trauma-informed approach. But it's looking at, okay, well, the behavior is usually serving a function, even if it's not a helpful function. Most children and most people either want to be moving away from something that's going to be causing them pain or moving towards pleasure. And so it's helping to understand, okay, well, what was the chain of events that led up to that? Or what's happening in the environment? Is it too noisy? Is it, and for a neurodivergent person in particular, it can be something like, a constant tapping on a desk that just is intense. We've got a lot of neurodivergent people who then have additional sensory difficulties like misophonia, for example, where the noises of chewing is too much and it's all you can hear. So hearing is a really big one. Sound is a big one. Lights, the different types of lights in our classrooms. And so a lot of these kids then become overwhelmed, or adults become overwhelmed. And then by the point we get to overwhelm, it's really difficult to sort of disentangle, well, what started first? And so then it's just that space we use a lot of sensory cocooning strategies. So just downtime, so darkening, using if it helps. And it's all about asking the individual as well what works for you. So it might be a particular playlist or sound. Music is a really big one for neurodivergent people. It could be helpful. Brown noise, things just to bring the baseline back to a state of, okay, I think I've got it all moving around in a way that I can make sense of it now. Yeah, so it's a lot. It's a lot to expect kids to know that. But if we can help them, and using what we know from coaching psychology to ask really helpful questions that are non-judgmental, and that if the kids can't find the answer, that's okay. It's not their responsibility to have the answer, that we'll figure this out together. I think I've learned from parenting my children that it needs to be a side-by-side approach. So it's not I, as the adult and your parent, know everything. My kids being twice exceptional, and I think probably the giftedness, and maybe there potentially some PDA stuff going on there. So if your listeners aren't familiar, it's a new profile, but where a situation that feels out of their control, they become quite stuck and fixed on their way of seeing the world. So they're quite resistant to anybody who comes in and says, well, there's a treatment protocol I want you to follow right now. Try this social skills activity and you'll be all good. We've really had to adopt a side-by-side approach with our kids. And it's been beautiful to watch them learn how to identify what's going on in themselves and find words to share that. But that's often a slower journey for neurodivergent kids. And so having that unconditional positive regard from a loving, safe adult and an environment where there's psychological safety makes all the difference. For anybody who's interested in the PDA profile as well, I've been doing a lot of reading and diving into declarative communication strategies. That's really helped for us. So declarative communication. So it's all about positioning an invitation, if you like, rather than placing a demand. So again, this is where I'd love to see the language change. So PDA stands for pathological demand avoidance. It's not in our DSM-5, which is what we use in psychology for diagnostic criteria. But there is really growing understanding that for a lot of our autistic, or a fair, that it's a profile, I guess, that shows up particularly in the autistic community, but I would say more broadly in neurodivergent community. And I would suspect probably a lot in our kids who have been exposed to trauma. But for those kids, the difficulties that they have in their executive functions, so that's in all of those, cognitive aspects of our brain, decision-making, risk-taking, impulse control, working memory, non-verbal and verbal, decision-making is really, really difficult. And that's where they experience that inner stress. So if we remember that our body is biologically driven to either move towards pleasure or to avoid pain, then when they experience that distress or stress within their internal system, they want to avoid the pain, don't they? So what a PDA kid will do is avoid your question or avoid your prompt because they're struggling to make a decision. Their cognitive brain is switched off anyway when their emotional brain is driven on. And if anyone wants to do any more reading around that, I'd sort of direct you probably to Dan Siegel's work. But what's really interesting with declarative communication prompts is that rather than having a question on demand, we might say something like, hey, so kiddo, I'm noticing right now that your heart rate looks a little high because you're breathing really heavily. And I see that you're sweating. And so I'm imagining that this might be a tough situation for you. I'm not sure. You're welcome to tell me. But, when you're ready, I'm really happy to work through some ideas of how to help calm you down. I'm just going to be over at my table. And so you might leave it then and then come back in a couple of minutes. Is it okay if I check in with you? How are you going? Are you ready to chat? So it's more of an invitation as opposed to a demand of, do you want me to turn the lights on? So do you want me to turn the lights on or do you want me to turn the lights off would be that kind of explicit, direct decision making. Whereas declarative is oh, I'm noticing this interesting thing that's happening in the world and I'm inviting you to explore it with me when you're ready. And for some of our kids, they can come back quite quickly. For others, they might need lots of time. So it just depends on who it is you're dealing with. Yeah, it's really interesting space. A lot of speech pathologists are trained and OTs in declarative communication. But there's, if you Google it, good old Google, you'll come up with some beautiful work there.
Oh, that's beautiful. I am going to look that up. I haven't heard of that term, so that's terrific.
Oh, good. Christy Forbes, if you haven't come across her, she does really great work in this space too, in autism and PDA in particular.
Thank you.
When I think about helping those students, how do we help
them identify their strengths and help them to understand the ways that they might find purpose and lead with purpose and feel comfortable to be in that school environment.
I guess in the education and psychology space, we talk about school avoidance and we talk about disengagement. And we were certainly, I mean, I don't know if it's a good segue to talk about Posify, but we were noticing this student disengagement prior to COVID, which is what got us co-founding the company. But I mean, post-COVID, it's just at least the numbers that we're seeing on paper. These conversations are always interesting for me because I have the dual experience of moving through this experience as a family. To two of these kids, one in particular who, I'm careful obviously not to share the specifics of his story because it's his story. But as a parent, I've kind of got my story that runs in parallel with his. And he's given me permission in the past to be quite public with, he's been through multiple schools because the lack of understanding and the lack of willingness to learn has become too problematic. And that's not, I don't think, through fault of any one teacher in particular, but just the constraints of a school environment and the fact that these needs are unique. And how does everybody have time and space to get on board when we've got all of these other competing demands in an education system that's really under a lot of pressure right now and under-resourced? So, for him, it was not even in terms of we've tried everything. We've had seasons of homeschooling. We've had seasons of blended learning. We've done the public system, the Catholic system, the private system. We've done Steiner. Like we have just moved where we've needed to move, and we're moving back into a season now of homeschooling just to get him through the education system. And he's had beautiful, beautiful educators along the way and beautiful experiences and great friendships. But there have been times where, because of what's going on for him developmentally, that the school environment and all of its demands and the way that it's set up is literally a daily trigger that triggers off stress responses. And I think as a parent, personally feel like it is too much responsibility for any one teacher or any one school sometimes to find the answers. And I'd love to see us move towards some different offerings with education and learning. And now that we know, the conversations around learning doesn't stop at year 12. We all are going to have these evolving careers, and we all have had. It's not really a new conversation. We've just rebranded it. But lifelong learning is one of the greatest qualities, most desirable qualities in the future and today. So I would love to see us move towards more open and honest and probably vulnerable conversations around how we can be a little bit more flexible and hybrid with our educational offerings, and how we can support communities, not just parents who are also, got their own demands, but how can we bring in all of our resources in our community to support this generation of kids? Because I feel like we're underutilizing a lot of different aspects. We've got basketball coaching groups, and we've got after school gymnastics clubs and dance performing places. And we've got NDIS groups that are doing all sorts of wonderful things as well. What would it look like if we could actually expand our thinking of a shared responsibility of caretaking and of recognizing that sometimes our learners need different learning environments? But I guess that's me being the eternal optimist, future forward thinking human. And there's a lot of steps that we might need to take before we get to that glamorous future. So I don't know that I answered your question, to be honest. I might have gone off in a little Maz dream there, but it's a really wicked problem that we're facing. And I think if there was a simple answer, we probably would have all done it by now.
Yeah,
it's complex.
I think there's more of a conversation, though, isn't there, Maz, being happening about this, because there are so many. I even hear in the school that I'm in, and they say, well, maybe this is not the right school for these students, or many of them are leaving because it's just not the right fit. But I do know there's places like Maz, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Woodline Primary School in Victoria. Yeah. So that's Lyle Stone and her partner Mel and a great team there. They're doing extraordinary things there, and that's just one sort of. There's so many different types of schools around that are doing fantastic things. But it's also about who the human is that enters that space. And then, what does a learning profile, I suppose, mean for them, and what does a learning plan look like for them? And, them being part of the process is really important. It's almost like how we learn together. There's so much. I think there's a much really to be opened somehow, because that's a big one. And I think it's getting more challenging in schools, in that there are students who aren't coping. There are those who just love that same sort of thing that their parents did, and the parents love that, but it's not the same for everybody.
It's different. And what's really interesting to me is that, at the same time this is happening in education, working in organizations and companies as well, the hot conversation right now is, well, how do we navigate this new world of hybrid work as well, where we've come out of COVID, where everybody was told they needed to stay in their little bedroom office. And now we're wanting people to come back into our workspaces and or not. We're wanting to stay completely remote. And how do we honor everybody's own workflow and still bring people together for collaboration and conversation and community? So I think this generation that we're educating, or that are coming into our classrooms and our learning spaces, are really, really switched on. They're hyper connected. They Google everything, and now they chat GPT everything. They have all the answers and none of the fear often that we have as adults through lived experience. And they're watching us. And I think the greatest teacher for any child is an adult that they respect and admire and who cares for them. And they're watching us as adults rock up. I mean, I'm talking to you right now in my slippers, right? So my kiddos who are on holidays right now, it's like, okay, guys, you can't come in and interrupt mum, because mum's going to have a really cool conversation with these two good humans for work in her slippers and her sort of messy hair, but you go off to school now 5 days a week. I mean, come on. I don't know. I think it's way more complex than what perhaps we'd like it to be, which is just the simple school refusal. And again, that's not to take away from suffering, but there's a lot of layers, isn't there?
Yes.
I'm glad you asked, Lisa. The cheeky question to lead into the Posify, right?
Yeah, I love it.
Oh, look. So, so many wonderful things that we could do. And I want this to be an iterative, generative, collaborative question and answer platform. So if those of your listeners who are joining us have ideas, let's all bandy together and share them. But my sister and I, so Jenna is my younger sister, and her background was first and foremost in the corporate sector, and she was as facilitator and in training. And then she moved into education. And so back pre-COVID, we got together because we were asking this really same question, and saying, like, how can we take what we see works well outside of schools in all of our co-curricular activities, and how can we leverage this idea of mentoring and of coaching and of community? How can we bring that to the kids, and how can we bring that to education in a way that helps families, community groups, workplaces, schools, to all get on board with some of what we believed needed to happen for kids. And what we believed needed to happen for kids, by the way, came from the kids themselves. So we did a lot of work around speaking to the next generation and asking what they would love to see brought into school, because kids identify learning as being at school. So back in 2018, my sister and I, we founded the Posify Group, and we did so to answer this question of what might it look like to come in and support schools and community groups and families with a personal development program that met them when they were really starting to unpack this big question of, well, who am I and how do I fit in the world? So that process of individuation that we know starts at around 10 or 11. And how do we help them, guide them through those senior years, through school and into employment? So for us at Posify, we're really interested in helping kids learn life skills, really. We do that through our use of human-centered design, modern career theory, and positive psychology, human behavioral sciences. And now more recently, we've started leaning into trauma-informed practices. We're doing a lot of work in the neurodivergent community as well. But we developed a trilogy series that takes the kids all the way through primary up into senior and then out into the workforce, and helps them connect with those three component parts that we know from the work of Matella and Steger to be helpful for meaningful living. So looking at what makes my life significant, how do I make sense of myself and the world around me, and then how do I develop a set of goals that are meaningful to myself and to the world? So, significance, coherence, and purpose. And if your listeners haven't come across that work, I can share that with you as well, that beautiful paper that they wrote. And so for us, the hope was, and what we're finding is happening, is that it starts a really collaborative conversation that's in unison between schools and between families and between then co-curricular community groups. So rather than kids being isolated in their personal and professional learning journeys just at school between those hours of 8:30 and 3 o'clock or whatever it might be, there's a platform. So we took our lessons and content online. We used to do just face-to-face workshops, and then hello COVID. So the Posify Academy is the first of that. The platform allows families and teachers and kids and coaches and whoever might be in a young person's life to share that learning and have those really rich and meaningful conversations with kiddos in a consistent way and in a way that gives everybody a shared language to have really tricky and exciting conversations about who they are, how they're seeing the world, how to make sense of it, and what they're wanting to become. So that's our contribution, but it's only one contribution. And the reason that we called it the Posify Group is because we always envisioned a collective of good humans who would share our vision of a shared community for education and learning, but not necessarily in the traditional academic sense, but that academic alongside that important personal development that comes with being a young person moving into adulthood in a way that's pro-social and contributory and where they can create impact. So that's what we're thinking. And I hope in sharing that it opens up some ideas for others. And I always love then the conversations that follow with, hey, did you know this person's doing this and this person's doing that? Because I think when we share those ideas, that's when the magic happens.
But I was thinking about the significance of mentors in communities. And I know that when our next generation are moving forward, they're always connecting and they seem to do it so beautifully. And by having a different voice rather than their teachers all the time or their parents all the time, it's other people that actually can inspire them to do those great big things that bring that purpose or an inspiration of contributing in some way. I think that's so important, so rich to have. And that connection is just key.
It is key. And interestingly, going into COVID, that was what the kids were saying. Actually, the program developed off the back of the research that I did with a conference called the Luminosity Youth Summit. Because what we noticed there was that the summit brings together all of these entrepreneurs and people from different career pathways into our regional town of Port Macquarie and gives kids access to see a future in front of them that maybe they weren't otherwise told about. So I was just fascinated by the impact that you could feel in the room. I presented that year on mindfulness and then was just blown away and actually ended up doing my my thesis for my master's on the impact of youth conferences on positive youth development. So that was kind of that was where the inspiration was born out of, in addition to the conversations we were having with kids. But when it came to COVID, where I think our scalable solution, which is fantastic because it gets it into everybody's hands and it's affordable and it's accessible, and I don't want to take away from that, but where it fell short, we quickly realized was that it was too explicit in the sense it was, even though it's a choose your own adventure and the kids navigate their own pathway, it lacked the storytelling that our face-to-face workshops had. And the kids were constantly feeding back saying, we want to see the stories. We want to understand from other people. We want to connect. We want to learn. We want to share. So we brought into our programs, which you get across that trilogy series, depending on the age, the idea of an impact influencer. So we went to industry and we asked industry who are really wanting to position themselves to this next generation as being thought leaders and as being purpose-driven, but don't necessarily have a vehicle or a way to access the kids. We said, well, will you be an impact influencer? Who in your organization does stand for something? And would they be willing to share their story of their own wayfinding journey, what it looked like to be that kid in the classroom to where they are now and where they want to go and what they want to learn from the kids. So Unify is our senior program. It's the one where kiddos from 16, so a lot of our twice exceptionals at 16 will join us because they tend to have different educational journeys and go into the workforce much earlier or drop out. That tends to be their pathway. So 16 right up to sort of 24. And that's more of a matchmaking, if you like. But we don't say it's the adult mentor to the youth because ours is a reverse mentoring program. And oftentimes we find that it's the adults that walk away with that really deep sense of increased meaning and satisfaction and purpose and learning. You know, I recently interviewed a beautiful psychologist who shared with me his thinking that if you haven't got a mentor who's under 30, then you're missing out. So not a mentee, but a mentor who's under 30, because they're just learning so quickly and they've got such beautiful big ideas to share with the world. So I think community and connection and intergenerational connection is where we need to head.
The power of the other is really quite powerful, isn't it? Like you know, if I think about where I have come to in my life has been other people have influenced it in different ways, mentors, counselors, you know, all of those people. I think it really impacts, I think, the story of the other person, or just knowing that there's someone there who sees you. Is powerful. And I guess, you know, when we bring it back to meaning and purpose, it reignites that, you know, and keeps that fire burning.
Absolutely. I think we are driven to contribute, and we're driven by nature as pro-social humans. We want to know that our lives matter and that we've made a difference, even if it's a small difference. And, you know, from the literature, it's unquestionable the large effect size that comes for somebody who is missing a sense of grounding in their life, and however that presents clinically, but helping them to open up to opportunity to give to something or someone other than themselves has by far the biggest effect on our mental health and on our sense of mattering. And I think that's what we need to leverage right now.
Also, there's that spirituality in us too. You know, I grew up in that sort of space, and you just can't. I always say to my mum, "It's your fault that I'm like this, Mum." And she goes, "I know." And she said, "And I'm actually really proud of that." And I said, "Well, I know, because now I do it to my children, and that's all they do. They always have a thing. Is this a service? Yes or no?" It's just incredible. But I wanted to just share something with both of you, and Leanne, you might not know this either, is that when you talk about the mentor under 30, so thank you to you, is that I joined as a kindness coach at the Bambuda group.
Yes, you did.
And I had two coachees, but one in particular that I'm still seeing, he's gone past his time at the Bambuda group, but he still connects with me because he just said, "I just want to keep talking to you." So we still meet every month, but I learn so much from him, and every single conversation I leave with this utmost, I would have to say it's spiritual and generosity feeling in my body. He is just phenomenal, and I can't wait. Every time, you know, it's our next time to talk, I could just be sitting there doing nothing and not actually talking at all, just listening, and I love it. And the ideas that he has and the impact he's making is just extraordinary. So I get a benefit, even though he thinks I'm benefiting of him. It is reciprocal, and I think I get more out of it. So that is a good thing. And that's community.
Oh, that's so nice.
That's beautiful.
Oh, Marianne, I would love to keep talking to you for the rest of the day. But I know that you've probably got things you've got to do, kids on holidays, and I know that you're going to sneak a little bit of time in for yourself, hopefully.
Oh, yes, please. That beach is calling.
I would like to ask, besides your own work, is there a book or podcast, TED Talk that you might recommend to listeners today? And I think the list is long, so maybe one or two, and perhaps we can share. Is that acceptable?
Did we note at the top of this call that my top strength is love of learning and that I am ADHD? So yes, the list is long. And when I read this question, I was like, oh dear, this is going to be a problem. But yes, can I also give a plug selfishly to Classroom 5.0? It's a podcast that I do host, but I'm plugging it not because I host it, but because the conversations that we've had with an extraordinary diverse array of good humans It's just a pleasure and a privilege. It's one of the most creatively rewarding projects I've ever done. But outside of my own podcast or our podcast, I love the psychology podcast, Scott Barry Kaufman. I think he also attracts such a beautiful, diverse population of humans, all contributing to the conversation, actually a lot of the time around neurodivergence as well, but around human potential. I also love his book, Transcendence, amazing book. You touched on spirituality as well, Lisa, and I think what's really interesting is the work, if you want to have a look at Dr. Tara Swart, she's written a beautiful book called The Source, and she's doing a lot of work in bringing together what we know in neuroscience now with the understanding of the intersection of science and spirituality, which is taking the woo out of the woo and bringing it to real world application. So I love her work, and the list is so long. I also want to give a plug for Karen Stain, who's another colleague of mine. Her new book, Be Your Own Leadership Coach, has just hit the shelves, and I'm very proud to be helping her launch that. It's really great in the sense that it's taking what we know from coaching psychology and positive psychology to the masses. So really empowering everybody to have these scientific solutions in their back pocket. So I would definitely recommend reading that, not just because I love Karen, but because it's just a wild book. But I will send you the long list.
We'll be sure to share it. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, Maz, do you have a favourite wellbeing tip or tool or strategy that you recommend to others frequently at all?
Yeah, my go-to has been self-compassion for years. Yeah. And I never really understood why until I got my ADHD diagnosis, and that all made sense. So self-compassion, but I think in order for self-compassion to be really effective, the other strategy I would share is the name it to tame it. So Sue Langley's work, and particularly for our kids, if we can help to identify what might be going on and not just naming the emotion, but what's happening around us, and then looking at some of our mistakes, our imperfect messes through that lens of self-compassion, and not because it's not important to grow and change, but because we can't grow and change unless we're kind to ourselves first and foremost, to activate all those beautiful motivation forces and good feels that help us to develop. So they'd be my one sneaky two thrown in.
Oh, I know. And self-compassion is just one of our favourites, and name it to tame it is definitely something we Anne and I are getting experts at.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a good thing to be an expert in.
There's a power in naming it to tame it, that's for sure. Mariane, we are so grateful for the time that you've spent with us today, and we're really keen to be able to share more of you with our listeners. So where is the best place for our listeners to find out more about you and the incredible work that you're doing?
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a treat, and there's been on and off recording conversations that I'll just treasure forever. Sorry to be the buzzkill to the listeners who might have missed the behind the scenes. We may have to share it. So you can find me on the internet, lots of different places, depending on where you want to and why you want to connect me. So for our youth work, the Posify Group, I'm happy to send through the links, but IG, so Instagram at Posify Group, same on Facebook. And it's just www.theposifygroup.com.au. And I've recently put together my own webpage to try and gather all of my messy and magical work in the one space. So speaking, there we go, speaking, coaching, messy magic program, all the other jazz that I do. So it's marianepower.com.au. But yeah, throw my name into one of the social media platforms and you'll find me rabbiting on about something, I'm sure.
It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you.
Oh, likewise. Thank you so much for the good work you're doing. It's having such an impact, this podcast, so keep it up. And it's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to join you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, how was that?
What a fantastic conversation. My mind is buzzing with what came out of that for me. And when we finish here today, Lisa, I'm going to explore it. And that's that declarative communication prompts. Yeah, that sounds quite interesting. Something I hadn't heard of before. So I'm really excited to go and explore it a bit more.
I think what's really valuable about that is it is the invitation so that it's a different way of communicating. So we're not telling people what to do or guiding them to it. It's more about inviting them and getting them to be aware of who they are and to let them know that you're there. And it's a safe, setting up a safe environment, which is really, really wonderful. It was really hard for me to even say one or two things about this conversation. I loved all of it. And I think what I love particularly about Mariane is that she lives and breathes everything that she's been sharing, and she has humans at the centre of everything that they're doing. So even in the Posify Group, Messy Magic, and she wants people to thrive and to, like she mentioned at the very, very beginning in her story, to try and eliminate the unnecessary struggle that people have and to get to understand their strengths, and doing that in a community as well. There's just so much, but so much to share. So hopefully we'll add that into our show notes and perhaps an article, because there's amazing. Just love the work she's doing with her sister as well, Jenna, and across fields. Just incredible human.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Have a great week. Take care, beautiful.
Bye.
Bye.
And thank you for listening to the Imperfect Us podcast. As always, we are extremely grateful to our executive producer, Brenton Ainsworth, for helping us to put this episode together. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with someone you care about, and we would be grateful if you could rate this podcast on iTunes. To continue the conversation and see what we're up to, you can connect with us on LinkedIn. Just search for Imperfect Us. Bye for now.